Hello and welcome everyone. In this video I will show how I've made the forest ground cover. This ground cover can be used to decorate any type of forest scenery. I will show all the steps needed to make this and apply it to a scenic base. For this tutorial I will be using this pre-made base. I've made this out of multiplex board, high density foam, some modeling clay and then gave it a coat of primer. I have a detailed build for a similar type of base in my swamp terrain video. As the first step, I cover the base with a coat of PVA glue. Over this, I'll be adding a few types of fine sand. I like to add them separate, but you could also use any pre-made mixture. This will serve as the first layer of the groundwork and also to provide a solid grip for the following layers. When the sand was added, I applied a layer of scenery glue to seal it in. You could use the recipe I listed here, but also my matte medium recipe, which can also be found on my channel. The next material I will use is this potting soil. This will make a nice material to use on your scenery, but in order to use this, it's best to sterilize it first by heating it. This is to ensure any fungus or bacteria gets removed from it. You could place it in the oven, but in this case I'm going to heat it up using a pan. I heat it up for around 8 minutes in this way, but try not to overheat it. Once it's baked, I use a strainer to end up with this fine material, which will give a natural look with little twigs and roots in it. The next material I will be using is this dried moss. I like to use this because it gives a lot of volume and texture. You could basically use any type of dried moss or some lichen for this. You could give it a few spins in a coffee grinder, but to keep it a bit more coarse, I'm going to chop it by hand. When you're doing this, you want to place down a wet kitchen towel first in order to keep your cutting board steady. I first remove the green bits, which I will use later on. Just for safety measures, I'm going to suggest cutting it with one hand. It doesn't need to be super fine, just take your time with it and run the knife through it a couple of times. I ended up doing it a bit quicker, but please mind your safety. With the moss done, I will now use this natural wood fiber. This is made for pets and you can usually find it at any grocery or pet store. Straight from the bag, it's a bit coarse, so I will give it a couple of seconds in this coffee grinder. To add some color to this, I added some brown and green ink, followed up with some water. You could also use dried herbs instead of this wood fiber, but if you're planning on using a lot on your terrain, then this material will be much cheaper. When it's mixed and colored, I add it to a sheet of baking paper so it can dry without sticking. To make a textured mixture out of this, I'll use this acrylic modeling paste. I then add some color to the mixture and add a mix of the other ingredients. Even though I will paint over these mixtures, I always like to add some color to it at this stage. This is optional, but if it ever should get damaged or chipped, it won't be as noticeable. It also makes painting the recesses easier by already having some color. Once mixed up, I apply it over the base. The sand I added earlier also helps to give this a solid grip, especially on smooth surfaces like dense foam or modeling clay. I then selected a few bits of dried branches and driftwood to use on the base. I clipped them into shape to make them appear a bit more natural. I used some of the mixture I made earlier and some PVA glue to blend them in. I had some of these mushrooms left over from my rainforest tree tutorial, so I decided to add some of those as well. I applied some super glue and added some on the larger tree logs. Next, I applied a light coat of acrylic primer over the base. I did an overall layer, but it's mainly aimed at the wooden bits and the sides of the base. When the primer had dried, I applied a layer of raw umber over the ground. I then gave the wooden bits a coat of tan earth mixed with green grey. I followed up by using a lighter tone and dry brushing this over some of the raised areas. To give the branches some more color, I added some black brown, followed up with green brown. The mushrooms were then given some color using some brown and orange stones. Next, I prepared a few oil washes. I take a drop of artist oil paint and dilute it using some odorless white spirit. I apply a greenish brown wash over the branches and follow up using Van Dyke brown for the deepest shadows. To make some fine moss for the base, I will use some mixed green herbs and grind them into a powder using a coffee grinder. I add some PVA glue to some random spots and add some of the moss over it. With the moss added, I then prepared some model leaves. You could use these pre-made model leaves, but if you're planning on using lots of them, then you may want to invest in one of these leaf punchers and make them yourself. To make them, I'm going to use some coffee filters. I like to use these because they have a slight texture to them. I cut off some of the edges to prepare them for the next step. To give them some color, I will mix up a few inks, washes and paints with some water. You could use any you like. I made a few brown, green and reddish brown ones for some variation, and then let them fully dry. I then use this leaf punch to cut out the leaves. With the first pass, you'll end up with having these pristine looking leaves. To get more out of them and give them a more natural look, I go over it a few times to add some broken leaves as well. I wasn't really sure how many I needed for this terrain piece, so just to be on the safe side, I made 4,736. But I think I only used 10% of this in total. I then used some more of the acrylic paste to serve as a second layer. I diluted this mixture a bit more using water and added some more color to it. I also prepared some pigment washes by mixing dry weathering pigments and water. When the first layer had fully dried, I applied the second layer to create some more volume. I decided to apply this layer in 3 parts to make sure the mixture doesn't dry too quickly. When this was applied, I added some random splashes of the pigment wash over this. I add some of the potting soil over this and work it in using an old brush. I follow up by adding some of the leaves over this. I also work these in by pressing them slightly into the soil. This will give them a bit more weathered appearance and blend in with the ground cover. I go back and forth doing this, gradually adding more leaves and potting soil to create a loose texture on it. As the next step, I will add a few small natural twigs, which I had saved from my previous video. I submerge them into the mixture and then add them to the base. I followed up using these steps for the rest of the base. Every now and then I spray it with some water in order to make it stick a bit easier. With the ground cover added, I will now give it a layer of scenery glue. For some more variation, I will also add some of these dried leaves, which I collected from a dried out plant on my balcony. To give them some color, I added some diluted brown wash and then applied some around the base. For the next step, I'll be adding a few small dried roots to the base. I also gave these a wash and added them randomly. I will then be adding some of these green ivy leaves over the roots. I add a few spots of PVA glue and attach some of the leaves here and there. Next, I'll be adding a few plants to the base. I use these plastic plants, which I have given a coat of green and yellow paint. I attach them using some of the soil mixture and some PVA glue. I will then add a few bits of the green moss I used earlier randomly around the base. bring in some color, I'll be adding a few of these dried flowers, which had given a light wash using magenta and purple. With all the vegetation added, I painted the sides of the base with a coat of black paint. To seal in everything, I gave it a coat of satin varnish. Alternatively, you could give it another coat of scenery glue. I'll then be adding a few water effects to the base. To do this, I'll use this 2-part epoxy resin. I mix up equal parts and stir it until it's crystal clear. In order to give it a murky appearance, I added a tiny drop of brown paint to it. I then carefully add some of this water in some recessed areas. With this, I'm aiming to create a few pools of rainwater. I then added a few floating leaves here and there, since I had quite a few left over. From this point on, there's many things you could add to this, which I will cover in future videos. So that'll wrap up this tutorial. I really hope you've enjoyed watching it and that it was of any use to you. I will leave you now with a few spins of the finished model. As always, thank you for watching, stay tuned for more and take care.
Work complete.